for the longest time, I've always struggled around, in terms of assessment and evaluation, the level 4 component, because percentage-wise, we know in Ontario, it's such a large range, right? So 80% to 100. And what does that look like in terms of the mastery piece, right? So if a kid does a mastery question,
today we talk about a big concern from many teachers, assessment in math class. More specifically, we speak with Steven Sevel, a teacher from Vaughan, Ontario, and from our online Make Math Moments Academy.
Steven has joined us for a Math Mentoring Moment episode, and like many of us in the Math Moment Maker community, Steven is continually asking questions about the best way to assess his students.
Stay with us as we talk about the purpose of assessment, standards-based grading, feedback, assessment tools such as Freshgrade, and mindset.
Let's hit it!
Welcome to the Making Math Moments That Matter podcast. I'm Kyle Pierce from tapintoteenminds.com.
And I'm John Orr from mrorr-isageek.com. We are two math teachers who, together,
with you, the community of educators worldwide who want to build and deliver math lessons that spark engagement,
fuel learning,
and ignite teacher action. Welcome, everyone, to episode number 52. 52 full weeks of goodness.
Wow.
The purpose of assessment. Another math mentoring moment. John, I think we are about ready to do this.
Let's do this. This is another Math Mentoring Moment episode with many more to come, where we have a conversation with a member of the Making Math Moments That Matter community, like you, who is working through a challenge, and together we brainstorm ideas and next steps to help overcome it. All right, before we get into this episode, we want to take a quick shout out to Lisa K. Coach. Kyle, tell us what she has said. She's left us a 5-star review on Apple Podcasts.
Yes. Thank you, Lisa K. Coach. She says, making math moments that matter is addictive. So glad I found this podcast. I discovered it just a few months ago, and I have already listened to almost all of the episodes. It has been a lifesaver in my first year as a math coach in a K-8 district. So many helpful resources. Thank you, Kyle and John. How awesome is that? Our hearts are full. And John, what are we hoping people who are listening are going to do right now?
Yeah, if you are listening, what we want you to do is we want you to go ahead and leave a 5-star review on iTunes. We want you to pause this podcast right now. We'll wait. Go ahead. Pause it.
Yep. We'll wait. Did they go?
Did they pause? They didn't go. Come on. You do it.
Come on now.
Right now. We'll wait.
You could do this. Pause it and go do that rating. We really appreciate it. It really helps us make sure that this message gets out to more educators from around the world. Thank you to all of you wonderful people who have taken the time to hit that 5-star, as well as leaving us a review. So today, thank you to Lisa K. Coach, and hopefully next episode, you will hear your review at the start of an episode. Awesome. Before we jump in, John, what else do we want people to know about?
Yeah, we've had lots of questions through email and social media about spiraling and spiraling math class. And maybe you've engaged in some of that learning already, or you've seen the tweets, or you've seen the messages on spiraling math class and you're a little bit interested in it. Or you even may have heard some of the episodes. We've had 2 previous episodes specifically on planning your course around spiraling your math class. So Kyle, tell us a little bit about those episodes. I think it was with Michael Rubin. Go ahead.
Yeah, Michael Rubin came on episode 40 and 42, and we took a deep dive into spiraling. So if you're uncertain of what spiraling is, make sure you head back to episode 40 and 42. As well, we've got a really cool resource that you can access right now by going to makemathmoments.com/spiral. And that is open to anyone to go ahead and grab. It's right on our blog. And also, there is a 3-day course that you can access. Again, wide open course. You just fire your email in there, and over the next 3 days, you will get videos, 3-part video series for you to engage in some learning around spiraling. So again, check it out. It's makemathmoments.com/spiral. And I think it's about time that we jump into our conversation with Mr. Steven Sevel.
Hey there, Steven. Thanks for joining us for a chat today. How are you doing this lovely summer afternoon? We are still in summer as the time of this recording, but let's get going here. How have you been?
Hey guys, I'm doing really well. I've had a great summer. For the month of July, I taught a math course through ETFO, through the union. So I taught math primary junior part 1, and I've also taught ELL part 1. But teaching that math course was really interesting. Lots of great questions and feedback and resources that myself and the candidates in the course were able to explore and share and learn from each other. So it was a phenomenal course. Yeah, other than that, obviously like all of us, we're counting down the weeks until we start school. A little bit of anxiety, nervousness, excitement. But looking forward to getting the ball rolling with mathematics and jumping right in and getting started for the school year.
That's super cool that you're doing the ETFO. For those listening outside of Ontario, that's like our elementary teachers union. So ETFO runs some online summer, and actually I think they do face-to-face as well, but primarily online. And actually I spent some time with some colleagues from my district. We had teamed up with the University of Windsor to do that same math primary junior part 1. So something that we can relate to for sure is some of the content from that course. And we had a lot of learning. I know as the instructor, I think I probably learned the most because, I get to engage in the planning and the delivery and seeing how it shapes up with those who are in the course. So super cool. So we want to know a little bit more about yourself. Where are you coming to us from?
Sure.
How long have you been teaching? And maybe a little bit about your teaching journey just to set the context.
Yeah, absolutely. So I live in Vaughan, which is just north of Toronto. I am teaching at a school in York Region District School with the York Region District School Board in Richmond Hill. So in September, I'll be teaching a grade 7 and 8 gifted class. So the gifted component is going to be new for me, but teaching a grade 7 and 8, I've taught both those grades for a number of years. I believe this is going to be my either 14th or 15th year of teaching. I'm sure with you guys, the years kind of roll together and, it all kind of becomes one, but I'm almost positive it's about 14 or 15 years. My journey has always been with the York Region District School Board. The school that I started at, I was there for 6 years teaching intermediate. And then I had an opportunity to move to a new school that was built to open up a new school. And I taught a grade 3-4 class, which was very new for me. It was challenging, lots of learning, but I was there for 2 years. And then I moved to Aurora, Ontario, and I taught at a French immersion school. So I was the first year where math was taught in English for students from grades 4 to 8. So that was a very interesting experience for me. I was there for about 6 years, and then I actually moved back to the original school that I started my career at for last September, which I'm going to be back in September as well. So bounced around to a few different schools, had different teaching experiences, but all within the York Region District School.
Awesome. Something that interests me, Steven, always is how and why we became teachers, but more so like lately, it's like how did you get into this? Like, what are the steps that led you to getting into the education field? Do you mind filling us in a little bit about that background?
So when I was certainly in high school, I had a phenomenal health and physical education teacher, and he really inspired me to want to teach. His delivery method, the way that he engaged us was just phenomenal. And I thought, this is just such a good person and a great teacher. Then, that was something that I wanted to do. So I went to York University. So I did my undergraduate degree in kinesiology and I minored in history because I wanted to teach at the high school level. And then I did my consecutive program at York as well. And then when I finished the program, when it was time to apply for a job, there were no jobs. It was very difficult. So I applied at the elementary level. And that's where I started my career. And as I was taking my phys ed specialist, I ended up being with the same teacher who I had as a high school student. He was the instructor. So It was amazing to reconnect with him again, certainly on a different level. But, still he brought that same passion, that same excitement, that same energy to teaching and that engagement piece that I remember as a student myself. It was great to meet him again and get back into it.
Fantastic. That's so awesome to hear. And what a cool way to kind of reconnect. You know, kind of comes full circle, eh? So
Exactly.
very cool, very cool. So we want to go back. So it sounds like this teacher in particular had sort of sparked something in you about teaching and wanting to inspire children and kind of almost follow in his footsteps. And as you went into the elementary panel, you started teaching all subjects, I'm assuming, but also It sounds like there was a little bit of a focus in math, especially in that school in Aurora. We're wondering, could you go back to your experience as a student, and being that this is the Math Moments or Making Math Moments That Matter podcast, is there a moment from math class that sort of sticks out to you? Could be good or bad, but one that sort of pops into your mind when you think about math class. What would that be?
So I can tell you just a little bit about my background. My family immigrated to Canada in 1989 from South Africa. So I came in August of 89 and started school in September of, of 89. So I didn't actually finish grade 3. I started in grade 4 when I came to Canada. And I missed quite a bit of learning there. So for me in math, I always struggled as a student. I was that student that never wanted to be called upon. I didn't grasp concepts quickly. It took me a long time to feel confident with math. I struggled through it all through elementary school and certainly in high school as well. You know, when I got to high school, I was also a little bit of the class clown who wanted to make everyone laugh and, hide behind the fact that I didn't really understand what I was doing. So my math journey ended in grade 11. And didn't take grade 12 math or the OACs. And, when I became a teacher, I was very nervous about teaching mathematics because I was, my insecurities with math, always thought that those would come out through my teaching. Looking back at my elementary experience, so unfortunately, the negative that really stuck out for me was, when the teachers would do the math baseball game with the flashcards and you would go around and compete against a partner in multiplication or addition with those cards. And I remember the anxiety that caused for me, knowing that, I would pretend to try to answer the question when I knew I couldn't. And I never got to move on to face the next kid or things like that. So I promised myself that when I did become a teacher teaching math, I wouldn't want my students to have that experience. I know other teachers like those games and, they create a little bit of competition, which some people may like. But I always found for me that pressure and that anxiety, especially for the kids that are struggling or who may have a learning disability, is not for them. So I've taken that through with me as I've, gone through my years of teaching.
It's such a common experience. And we said that here on the podcast before, that we've asked people to remember those math moments. And so often it's that game that has put people in front of the class to show their skills in a competition head-to-head format. That game takes a variety of different names, like you said, baseball, but it's Round the World or even some Mad Minutes kind of type game. It's that keeps popping out when we ask people their math moment as something that's, like you said, sparked anxiety and caused a lot of emotion. And for some reason, that's what stands out for people. That sums up a lot of the issues that people have had in math before they became teachers. So thanks for sharing that memory. Let's move into some of your teaching right now. Do you mind sharing, think back to your classroom right now or the last year or two or even before, but do you mind sharing a success you've had in class and what that looked like?
Sure. So it was around this time last summer, we were invited to hear, is it Peter Liljedahl? I'm probably pronouncing his last name.
Yeah, Liljedahl. It's kind of
Liljedahl.
Yeah.
And his work blew my mind. The non-permanent vertical learning on this was amazing. And that's something that the first week of September, I jumped right into all the way to the end of the school year. And that was a real aha moment for me in my learning and my teaching, because I could see the engagement with my students. And I could see how it fostered a sense of them working together as opposed to relying on me as the teacher for the answers. And I guess it really is taking ownership of their learning in math. So that was something that I love doing. And, I still have a lot of questions that I would like to ask Peter and go attend maybe if there's more of his seminars as well, especially around assessment and evaluation. But that whole dynamic of shifting the way that the students learn the mathematics and, the structure of the classroom was really important as a big learning experience for me that come September of this year, I will definitely be doing all the time.
Awesome. Super cool. We had the pleasure of bringing Peter onto the podcast back on episode 21. Okay. So that's something we'll stuff into the show notes for everyone who's listening. If they haven't listened yet, it's one of the most frequently listened to episodes. And we actually get a lot of feedback from people about wanting to learn more, his research. And much like you're saying, we found such a quick change. It was like, it's such a low hanging fruit, right? It's like once you get kids up and working, it's like night and day. 100%. Whereas there's other things we do in the math classroom, sometimes it takes time for us to work out the protocols and make that sort of process and procedure with our students sort of like a regular thing. But that was something that was super quick for us. So it sounds like that's something that you're going to continue diving into, which is great. I'm wondering, how about any struggle or challenges? We just recorded an episode recently and it was awesome because the guest, his name was Asim. He said, I only have about 1 million struggles or challenges, but we'll focus on one for today. So John and I feel the same. What about you? Is there any struggles or challenges or just something that's on your mind lately that you want to chat about?
Absolutely. So I posted in the community around mastery assessment. And that's something that I dabbled a little bit with in May and June of last school year. And also really amazing learning about how does that look like in the classroom? How do you do that? How does that work with assessment and evaluation? And I know on, John, your website, there were some links to Google Sheets that were created to record assessment practices. I opened those up and I looked at it and first of all, blown away by the detail in these documents that Kyle, you and John have created, which are phenomenal. And I thought to myself, this is something I want to use, but I have no idea how. And then I started to ask myself, well, how did you guys get there? What does mastery assessment and mastery days look like in your classrooms? How do you capture that data and then turn it into a mark? How do you communicate that with your students and with the parents of your students? And really, what does that look like in your classroom? I certainly see a lot of benefits, just not quite sure where to start and how to unfold or bring that into my classroom, into my teaching. That's a really big focus for me that I'm hopeful through your guys' experiences it helped me out. And it's certainly everybody else who's interested in the academy.
Right. We were just talking to somebody last night about this on the live Q&A from the Academy, and they had brought the same kind of thing up. And I had mentioned that next on our kind of docket is to create a mini course around mastery days and portfolios and how we're assessing. So assessment in math class. So we're glad you brought this up too, because it's kind of on our front so far. So it'll be one of the mini courses in the Academy, but soon. But let's chat about it here today. So you haven't started with any of the resources yet. You're still looking for how to get started, or you have kind of dabbled a little bit?
Yeah. So like I said, I had a one-day PD session within my school, and where it started with one of our math consultants that said, you take those specific expectations for that specific strand that you're teaching and turn them into I can statements, basically your learning goals. And then from there, kind of break it down into a beginner, intermediate, or expert, or 3-level type of question where you would want your students to assess or to start with. And part of what they were saying was what's unique about the tiered assessment is that it gives students ownership as to where they are in their learning. And it gives them opportunities if they want to become a master in that particular strand or topic or expectation. So I tried it with my class. When I I started with patterning. I found some patterns that I thought were more of a beginner type of pattern. So really just kind of meeting the expectation. And then an intermediate where it's a bit more challenging. And then looking at an expert type of question where it's still the same grade level curriculum expectation, but more in depth. And presented these 3 questions to my students and had them decide where they wanted to start in their understanding of this particular expectation. We used the vertical math to look at some of the problems as well. And then it came time for me to assess them. So I shared with you guys a sample. So I'd given them a 1-sheet quiz where there was a beginner, intermediate, and an expert question. And I said, okay, you guys choose the one question that you want to answer. So while I was doing that, I was thinking to myself, how am I going to mark this? So I was so used to using a rubric where on my assessments, I would break them down based on the achievement chart. And from there, I was told, okay, well, when you're doing this mastery assessment, you don't necessarily use a rubric anymore. So then I was thinking, well, Do kids get perfect? Does that mean they're a level 4 if they get the mastery correct? What happens if they choose the expert question and they make a calculation error? Does that mean they're not at the expert level? Do they go then do the intermediate question? Mm-hmm. So I had lots of questions kind of running through my head as my students were answering these types of questions. So what I ended up doing is, as you can see on this assessment here, so for example, I had said, so for the expert question there, the highest they can earn is a level 4. So if they did everything correctly, I would give them a level 4. And then I kind of looked at still using the rubric because that's what I was very comfortable with in terms of my assessment, giving them the level 4 for the expert type of question. But if they made a mistake on the expert question, I would hand it back to them and say, you need to go do the intermediate question and then mark that one. And then if they got everything correct on that question, then I would give them a level 3. But I found that I don't know even if I did that correctly. I don't know in terms of mastery assessment if that's even right. But I found my students were definitely engaged in this kind of assessment. But like I said, I don't even know if this is the correct way to do it.
I guess let me ask you this question, Steven. What do you view the purpose of assessment to be?
So for me as a teacher to know where my kids are in their learning and understanding of the expectation, and certainly for them to know, okay, these are my strengths. This is what I have to learn. This is what I'm good at. This is what I need to work on.
Right.
So looking at that assessment for as and of learning, certainly that as learning piece is not evident in this particular assessment, but for them to know, okay, I'm an intermediate level. I've met the expectation. What do I need to do to become an expert in this particular assessment? So there's twofold to it, but I don't know, like I said, I don't know if this is right because I was told we're supposed to record all these different types of check marks. If they meet the expectation, they get a check mark. They made a calculation error, but they understand the concept, they get a check minus. You're supposed to have these series of circles and dots and checks, but I don't know how that all comes together at the end.
And it's so common, John and I feel like we have this discussion very often with different educators because we constantly, as math teachers in particular, we feel like there's a right or a wrong. And I don't think there ever is a wrong. The only thing is there's a different perspective, there's different approaches, and there's different beliefs. So, John's question about what you believe the purpose of the assessment to be, I think what John was getting at there is if we think about what is it that I want this assessment to do? And then once I've done that, I essentially set myself a learning goal for myself around am I hitting that learning goal with this assessment? And I wonder if, and this is a wonder, I'm not suggesting it to be true or not, but I wonder if maybe the way you're doing it, something about it isn't matching up or isn't aligning with what you just said to be the purpose of your assessment. And maybe that's why you're feeling like it's wrong.
Yeah.
Maybe it's wrong for you. I'm not going to say it's wrong for everyone, but for you, I think that is the key, is coming out. And the hard part about all of this, and I really loved what you said earlier. I jotted some notes down about the workshop that you went to, the one-day PD session. First of all, one-day PD session's really hard because it's almost kind of like a little appetizer, right? It's, here's some big ideas. Yeah, try this out, think about it. Clearly, it had an impact on you because you have been thinking about it, which is great. And then you had mentioned some of the suggestions from that consultant who suggested taking specific expectations, turning them into I can statements. Or now I'm starting to think, I can't remember who I heard say this, but switching that from I can to I will statements is kind of nice. It's a little more growth mindset-y, not like I can by tomorrow, but it's we'll get there. And then breaking them down into beginner, intermediate, expertise type assessments. I think that's a really cool approach. And I think that can be one way to approach it. But I think one of the key pieces we want to make sure that we don't miss here in this conversation is that there are so many different ways. And for John and I know for us, every year we've done this sort of grading, it's kind of evolved. So that's the other piece too, is that obviously constantly reflecting, constantly massaging what this looks like and sounds like, I think is a really good thing. But trying not to put that pressure on yourself like it's got to be perfect the first time you try it. I think as long as you're constantly coming back and reflecting on that learning goal for yourself, that goal of what assessment is. Like for John and I, like assessment for us is to help kids learn. So like we look at it and we think like, I don't just want to get kids to this idea of mastery. And even the idea of mastery for me is starting to shift a little bit. I had a great conversation with a gentleman named Phil Darrow. He was one of the writers of the Common Core in the US. And he put this idea in my mind that I really like, that he said, using the term mastery might not even be a really great idea for mathematics because there's no such thing. He said it's like an apprenticeship, right? You're constantly getting better. And by even giving this idea that you've mastered something, maybe we're telling kids as if like there is this end goal. And I'm going to argue that this process you're in right now might be very similar. Like, I don't know if you'll ever master assessment, but I bet your expertise in assessment or in your practice of assessment will continually grow until that last year of your career, right?
Right.
So I'm wondering, like, when you think about that, and you're thinking about whether you're doing it right or wrong, is there anything that maybe pops in your mind about your beliefs about assessment, and then maybe what this is sort of doing or going to do for you that maybe isn't jiving? Is there anything like that you might be thinking?
For the longest time, I've always struggled around, in terms of assessment and evaluation, the level 4 component, because percentage-wise, we know in Ontario, it's such a large range, right? So 80% to 100. And what does that look like in terms of the mastery piece, right? So if a kid does a mastery question, they get all of it right, is that 100%? But I've always really looked at, in terms of my assessments, how I would set up, a unit test or a performance task, was I tried to break down the questions based on the achievement chart, because I felt like in order for me to justify giving a student a level 4, they have to demonstrate a level 4 across the achievement chart. Simply getting 20 out of 20 on a knowledge and understanding type of question doesn't show me that you have strong understanding across the achievement chart.
Right.
So the achievement chart has really played an integral role of my assessment piece. But when looking at this mastery part, I didn't see where the achievement chart came in. So maybe I still have a lot to learn about mastery and where maybe it does play. I don't know, maybe you guys can help me with that. But that's why, on the sample question here, I thought to myself, I don't know how to mark this properly. I don't feel confident if a kid got an expert question correctly, they're 100%. That's why I said, I still feel comfortable using a rubric type and relating it to the achievement chart to help me justify my marking. Does that make sense?
Yeah, makes sense. Let me ask you this. When you mark that, and like you said, you did this, and let's say you put a mark down on that page, what came next? Like, what did you do with that number?
So what I would do is, and because it was such a short assessment, I would call each individual student up and show them the mark, and I'll say, okay, so for example, if they didn't get it correct, if they attempted the mastery question, they made a mistake, I didn't prompt them. I just said, you need to go do the intermediate one, and then come back and show me and I'll mark it again. If they only had done the intermediate or the beginner and they had made some mistakes, I would give them oral feedback and kind of prompt them to where they may have made their errors to help them work through it.
Now, when you wrote the number down on the page, though, or you checked it off in your rubric, I guess what I'm asking is, how did you record that?
Google Sheets, I've got my mark book there, and I would record it as a percentage.
Okay, so then you would record as a percentage on a Google Sheet. Where in the Google Sheet? Can you give me a picture of what that kind of like overall, how all this kind of fits together for you currently? And I think knowing that for us and you kind of verbally saying it, I think we can start to kind of see where we can start filling in some of the gaps for you.
Right. So, having now watched the videos on spiraling, I wasn't spiraling the curriculum and I was teaching it in individual units. So my patterning unit, I would have a Google spreadsheet. Okay. And at the top, down the side would be all my students' names. And at the top would be the specific expectation that I was teaching. Okay. Within that expectation, I would have the cells broken down into knowledge, understanding, application, thinking, and communication. And then whatever level the students earned on that particular assessment, I would record each individual level. Okay. And then at the very end, I would have a series of percentages for that particular unit. And then whatever their most consistent level was, that's what they earned in that particular unit or string.
Gotcha.
So that's how I would do it.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it gives us a snapshot of what that looks like. And I think for me, I would used to put that in my mark book and I would average all those out or look at your most consistent. I think most consistent, is something that is harder to think about because it's like, well, what do I give that student? I've adopted to think like we've talked about what is assessment's purpose. We do have to turn this into a number at some point. And I think we get hung up on the idea that I have to get a number for a kid and that number has to stay in there. And there's so many moving pieces to kind of write down this number. And I think we've talked about this idea of being right all the time. And I think for us, being right is using our professional judgment to come up with a number that we feel represents that student's current learning on those learning goals. And, even merging all of those learning goals together has to happen somehow. And if it happens with this weighting over here, or if it happens with this weighting over here, or that teacher weights them differently, like so much variety is happening across Ontario and even in the United States on that. It's like, we've talked about this being right. Like, I think if you've got the kid's best interest in mind about how to push the learning forward, after, the 15 years I've teaching, just like you, I've put less of a weight on the actual number because I just want the kid to learn at a deeper level on those concepts. So we have to put the number together somewhere. But at that point, it's so all over the place across everywhere anyway, it's hard to say like which one's right. And I don't think what we talked about, I don't think there is this right way to do it. I think the right way to do it is as long as we're pushing that kid's learning forward and that they've taken that information that you're communicating to them and they've used it to help their learning. And again, that number is mostly for parents, right, too. And it's like, how does that help them communicate how that kid's learning is on and push their learning forward? So I think it's important to come up with that number, and it's important to think about how you come up with that number. But I don't think, as long as you feel confident in that student's abilities and you feel confident communicating that to parents, I think you can't be wrong. So it's kind of like, I think you can run into trouble if you don't know how you calculated it or you're relying on someone else's process. They're like, okay, the teacher across the hall is like, I do this, this, and this, and this, and that pumps out a number. And if you're just relying on that, but not taking into account the student's learning, you can run into trouble there. And that's where I think parents will be like, well, you wrote this number down here, like why? And then if you don't actually think about the kid's learning, you might stumble and you might feel not confident about what you're doing. But if you have the kid's best interests in mind, you know exactly where that kid stands on the learning goals. I don't think you're going to run into trouble because your confidence will show that. Even when parents question you on these ideas, like, well, I think they have an 80, but you wrote a 75. Like, what's the difference? And if you can bring up this record of, they've demonstrated this multiple times on this learning goal. They've demonstrated this multiple times on this learning goal. I would gladly give them this if they can continually consistently show that skill. But, I don't feel that they have done, how you can talk to parents. So we've talked about that a few times, right, Kyle, about this idea of using assessment to understand what your students know and how to push them forward. And I think that's the important goal here. And the number kind of is hard to calculate, but almost not as meaningful as the other information.
I like what you said there, John. And when I come back, I'm just popping back up on the screen. I had the achievement chart up for those who are watching this in the Academy. I know those who are listening to the podcast, you can't actually see the visuals here. Also, I just popped back to the quiz that you had and this rubric. And something that I think is really hard for us as teachers is trying to balance, like, what do we do for our own organization and how much of that do we need to show with students? So, for example, up here, I'm seeing like you have like, I can solve a beginner question, I can solve an intermediate question, I can solve an expert question. While I would argue that it's good for you to have sort of like an idea in mind of like, I picture it as kind of like a trajectory of this idea. So if it's solving multi-step linear equations, I have this trajectory in my mind of like, typically we start with these types of problems, then we move on to these types that are a little bit more in depth, and then more challenging problems at the end. Do I necessarily want students to see that and like have them see that this one's a beginner and this one's an intermediate, or is that something that can be for your own organization? Like I know what I tended to do with this type of assessment is last night we had a spiraling conversation with one of our Academy members. And the spiraling discussion links so nicely with this idea of standards-based grading. Like they kind of go hand in hand because it's really hard to spiral a course without breaking your assessment process down into smaller pieces. Unlike what I used to do, which was like assessing by an entire unit. I would spit out this mark. I wouldn't have any idea of what kids are struggling with. I would just say like, oh, if you got a 70, well, 30% of the stuff you didn't get, but I had no idea what it was. I didn't know what the concepts were. So for me, standards-based grading and kind of working towards building the expertise of our students over time, one of the huge benefits is to help them focus in on the areas that they're actually struggling with. And so that we can have that discussion, as John had mentioned. But on the other hand, when I'm giving the assessment, maybe what I can start doing is like, I'm looking at your beginner, your intermediate, your expert questions that you've sort of categorized. And maybe those happen throughout the year. Like maybe earlier in the year, it's like beginner stuff. And it's not saying you can't, a student's ahead of the group and you want to challenge them. So like individually, you can differentiate by allowing them to work on some more challenging problems now. But like as a class, maybe that's a great way. Like the fact that you've organized your content this way, or you're planning to do this way, is that maybe it's like you try to focus on beginner everything early in the year. Okay. And then we kind of go deeper as the year goes on. So it's almost like kids gradually work their way from beginner to intermediate instead of really quickly. Like that's the way a unit-based organization of a course would work, right? Like day 1 to 3 of a unit is like pretty beginnerish. And then the middle of the unit is like, oh, okay, it's kind of getting a little harder, like you're going deeper. And then the end of the unit is where a lot of students sort of fall off the wagon, or at least they did in my classes. So now it's like I have this opportunity to get everybody really confident with beginner type stuff, or like the intro stuff. And then as we kind of spiral back, we can then go deeper, and then we go deeper and deeper. And then next thing you know, it's near the end of the school year. And now the whole end of the school year is dealing with more of these higher expertise type problems, because that's where we're at. And we don't have to proceduralize that. You don't have to plan it like, well, from this month to this month, we're only going to do this type of problem. Like, I don't want anyone to walk away thinking like no one will ever work on anything challenging in the first 2 months of school. But it's like just in general of this idea of how do I ensure that everyone has a deep understanding, at least with this intro of all the concepts in my course. Like something that a lot of teachers struggle with as well is time. They don't make it to the last unit or even the last 2 units of the curriculum because they've run out of time. Well, kind of doing the spiraling idea allows you to ensure that you've actually hit everything in the curriculum, at least at some sort of surface level. And then you can kind of dig a little bit deeper there. So I kind of look at those two things as pretty tightly connected. And the only real purpose for assessment for us is this idea of ensuring that students know where they're at. Like you had said, it sounds an awful lot like your beliefs, like so they know what they're doing well with, and then they know what they need to work on, and it gives them something more targeted so that they can continue diving deeper. So I don't know if you have any thoughts on that or any sort of takeaways from that little conversation before we kind of dig a little deeper here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I completely understand what you guys are saying. As you were talking about, John, as well, I was thinking about, we have the triangulation of our data and what does that look like and how to bring that all together, and just bringing it, like I said, how do you now start to capture that learning? That's also been a big question for me. As teachers, we're saying our conversations, our observations, and our products. I'm not sure if you guys have experienced this in your careers, but when you had mentioned, John, when you had mentioned parents, as teachers, when they say, well, Mr. Sevel, how did you come up with this mark? That nervousness can sometimes tend us to lean more towards the product piece, because you can pull out the test and say, here's this test, right? This is a big part of their mark. Whereas the conversation and the observation piece is a bit more subjective. So how do we now show parents or communicate that piece of the conversation, the observation component, to parents? And how does that now influence our overall assessment piece? And how do we capture that? So that was going to kind of me leading into the next component for the questions I have for you guys is maybe it's more of a tools piece. What does that look like in your classroom? How do you capture that data? How do you share that with your students, your parents, and so forth.
I gotcha. So for keeping the purpose of assessment in mind here and having that triangulation of data is so important. And I think you're right. We have, as math educators in particular, have placed a very high importance on the product and not the other two things. And I think for me, for many years, it was only product, like the quiz or the project or an assignment comes in after the learning has happened. And I've placed all the grades on that one thing instead of the other two things. What have you done so far, Steven, to include observations and conversations?
It's just really been conferencing with students and taking down notes based on what they've said. I've done it more in my language class, and I'm trying to bring it more into my math, where I have my success criteria. And, as the kids are explaining things to me, I'm checking them off. I try, when they're doing their vertical math, to listening in on their conversations and using that checklist to record and check off who said what. But again, it's that, now when I come back to assess it, it's a bit messy, right? Because I don't know how much do they truly understand of that particular question when we're doing the vertical math? Is it more their partner who's leading the discussion? So it's hard to put it all together. But that's kind of what I try to do, at least, is more of those individual conferences with my students to really understand where they are in their learning of that expectation.
You said an important point here about listening, and the vertical non-permanent services has been, like you've alluded to and experienced, that listening to your students work through problems is valuable information. I think we have to have good memories, because sometimes it's like we don't have time to write this down or do the checklist and I think we get caught up too that we have to, that we have to have this evidence to show everybody. And I think, after a few years of doing this now is that I come to the realization, like my other realization, is that we don't always have to have this proof and over to somebody. I think having a conversation with a parent about a child's learning, once you have that positive conversation and the parent gets a sense that you have that kid's best interest in mind for their learning, they're not going to be like, well, okay, show me this exact moment, where you can say, well, we had this conversation. I remember it. And Kyle's said this before in the podcast that, if you want to bring your son or daughter back in, and we can do it right now to prove consistently that they do know these things that we're talking about, then let's do this, because I want them to learn. I want them to show me, or I want them to have that conversation and pull that from them. So I think that listening is important. And obviously, seeing the work done vertically is helpful. In terms of tools, Kyle's right now on the screen showing that blog post about a way to kind of track information from the students. I've evolved a little bit past that since we wrote that a few years ago. Kyle, what year was that post where we created the spreadsheet? I think 2014.
Yeah.
January. I have it up on my taskbar at the top here. And, over the last couple of days, I've been really going through it and trying to understand it. And first of all, guys, it's amazing work. Like, your expertise in Excel and using those formulas are phenomenal.
This all came from Alice Keeler.
And I went on to her.
All linked up in here. And when John saw it right away, and it was like, all of a sudden, light bulbs went off. And this was kind of one of the first big projects John and I kind of worked on together, right? We're like, how can we take that and how can we make it work for what we were trying to do at the time is essentially what you're discussing. Like, essentially, you mentioned earlier in the discussion about, so what was the process like? And I'll tell you, by doing this project, I'm not suggesting you go try to create this crazy spreadsheet. I think there's better ways, and I let John talk about that shortly, since he's been using it in the classroom consistently. But this process really helped us solidify what it was that we wanted to try to achieve in the classroom. It forced us to be more reflective. Like, it's great to reflect on your own, but I find when I do things, that's why on my site, Math is Visual. Like, I have all these math visuals that I create. Most of the time, the reason I'm creating those is because I'm trying to solidify my own understanding of the concept. So I'm going and I'm like playing with these ideas. And as I'm building these animations, I realize some of my current conceptions aren't quite accurate, or they're not as accurate or as clear as I thought they were. So it's like some of the issues pop up through doing some of this work. So I think that's where you, Steven, will probably do most of your learning as you continue taking your curriculum and your content, like the actual tasks that you're doing and what it is you're trying to assess. And I always say it's kind of like you've got the big idea, like these are the big things I want kids to leave my classroom with. And then you have like these granular ideas. And I think understanding as the teacher, the granular ideas is really important, but then trying to group them into like something that it's kind of like the happy medium between the big idea and these granular ideas is where you want sort of the kids hanging out so that it's not too overwhelming. Like if it's too granular, it might be too overwhelming for them, but it might be essential for you to organize, like, how am I going to teach this? And maybe by the end of the course, the more granular pieces start to make more sense to the students. But imagine how hard it is for us as the educator trying to just organize the content. And we already have our degrees. Like we already went through university. So imagine how hard that must be for kids. If we go big idea and we stay big idea for the kids, then it's like that probably isn't clear to them. If we go too granular, then it's like, whoa, that's overwhelming. So like, how do I find that middle ground here where the assessment process helps the students? So that's where I was talking earlier about like that front facing part, like what do kids need to see? And maybe that changes throughout the school year as well. You know, like maybe earlier in the year, it's a little more general. And as the year goes on, it starts to get a little bit more specific as you go, like your success criteria is growing as you go.
If you guys don't mind me asking, in terms of your own personal assessments, do you use the rubric? Are you an out of 20 type of in terms of your assessment piece? So do you blend both together? What does that look like for you guys in your classrooms?
I'm more of the rubric kind of end of things. And so that's when you're looking at that blog post and the numbers that we were putting into that spreadsheet was kind of like a guideline or a placeholder for a kid's current learning on that learning goal. So we would give our weekly quizzes on our mastery days, or our portfolio days is now usually what I call them. And I would look more holistically at the problem. And I tried to choose problems that are approachable to multiple ways of tackling it. And I think when I do that, I'm looking for a particular learning goal. So I might have like your learning goal that you had up on the screen there, like maybe like solving multi-step linear equations. But I might choose one that could show that, but also show different ways of doing it. Like it's also like possible you solve it by inspection or solve it by, other versions of the techniques. And I've been big at that with communicating to my students that if you can solve problems in various ways, or not various ways, but I mean, in different ways than say what we've talked about exactly in class, I'm going to take that into account. And so when I go to grade them, I'm grading them for how can I help my student get to where they're supposed to be on that learning goal, or where we want to move. So I have to think about where they currently were. And then I'm usually writing feedback. So it's like a quick sentence or two to that student on that question. So my questions are like yours. It's like maybe 3, maybe 4 questions per week. And I'm going to write feedback on how to make them move forward. We've talked about this last night, and we talked about this with John Hattie on episode 35. I mentioned that I don't write a number on that to the student right then. Like I record that, and like I would have wrote that down on that spreadsheet that you saw. But what the student then sees first is just the feedback. And I think Kyle is showing you one of those kind of quizzes.
I was going to ask you that.
Yeah. So the feedback spot right there is for me to help them move forward. And then on those days, those portfolio, or, I call them portfolio days, growth days, we hand that to them and say, like, let's fix this. And that's where there's spots for corrections. I don't want them to erase anything. I want them to see the growth. I want them to value the growth. And then I take that into account. It's mandatory that they work towards fixing it. And do they get it right the very next time? No, it's an ongoing kind of thing.
Kyle, if you just scroll up for a second, I just have a question, because I saw this. Is it Freshgrade?
Right.
So that's an online tool that you use.
Yeah, I can show you what that looks like. And that's how we've evolved from the spreadsheet. What we found with the spreadsheet, and I think you are experiencing some of this from some of the comments you've asked in the academy, is that it is clunky and you can easily wreck it by copying the wrong slide not slide, but cell to the wrong cell, and everything just mucks up. So
John,
yeah, go ahead.
Sorry to interrupt. So down below, you give the kids that pencil. It's a pencil and paper task. Yeah. They do this assessment number 1 here. Then you give them the feedback, and then you record their work in this Freshgrade.
Yep.
And then you hand them back this particular sheet.
Right. And they also record the work in the Freshgrade. I'll share with you my screen in a moment here on how that looks, because these pictures don't have a lot of info from this when we first tried this. But yeah, that whole idea is it's like Freshgrade has been a way for us to capture learning, and students do a lot of that self-reflection for them. And I think that's been helpful for them to see, like, where am I on my learning journey on this particular learning goal? So you'll see all that.
So John, do they do that self-reflection piece right then and there in class with you, or do they do that at home?
I can do it either. It's online. So Freshgrade is an online kind of portfolio tool that's a free account for anybody. And actually, the time of this recording, they're just about getting ready to launch their next version. I think they even called it Next, which has a lot of improvements. I've been in communication with the tech team and some of the sales team about what's changing. And they've taken a lot of feedback in over the last few years, and especially being able to record multiple assessments on different learning goals. I'm calling them learning goals, but they've made this tool very general so that anyone can use it any way they like. And it fit with what Kyle and I were mostly doing with our spreadsheet. So it kind of it allowed us to kind of build our spreadsheet in the Freshgrade with more tools and easier tools, and you can't mess anything up anymore. So we moved there. It doesn't have all the functionality that we really liked from our spreadsheet. Our spreadsheet was pretty powerful, especially with some of the automations that we had with a student demonstrating consistently that, you know, their level 3 or 75 on that learning goal would automatically kind of show them what they can do next, which was different than somebody who is consistently showing a 65 or a level 2. They would show them. So there was a lot of automations that we built into that spreadsheet. Freshgrade doesn't have that yet, but does have a lot more easier tools to kind of capture observations, like making use of the camera tool, which is has been amazing in Freshgrade. So I can share you my screen, but that's kind of where the basics of that comes from. And it's been great for students thinking about their growth on those learning goals. So if you can see my screen here, so here's kind of the grade book. So you can see these are learning goals across the top. So right now I'm looking at for everyone listening here, I'm looking at mostly it looks like a chart that has columns and rows, and the rows are names and the columns are titles, and the titles are the learning goals. So very much like what somebody's grade page might look like already. But the power is when you go to look at a student's portfolio. The portfolio is here, and if I highlight a student's portfolio, let's just pick this one here. So this is what the student would see, and they would see kind of these pods, which are kind of like boxes. And each box is, I've titled them learning goals. Freshgrade built it to, they call them activities, but Freshgrade built it to be very, you can use it in any subject, but we've built our spreadsheet here. And then what I love about that is you can grade, assign a grade value to that learning goal, which is that student's current learning goal grade. It's kind of like, this is where I am currently on my journey on that particular learning goal. I like that students can upload images of their current work on that to help showcase their learning on that learning goal. And so each learning goal is like a collection of evidence. I can comment on that. We can have a conversation about those things. They take pictures of anything they do in class and add that, or video or audio. Sometimes you can just record a conversation with a student just on your phone, and then boom, just tag them and it goes right in there. So as I said, it's a lot more functionality, not all the functionality, but a lot more functionality. And it's easy to pull up in the parent-teacher interview. It's kind of like, here, let's talk about all of this stuff that we've seen from our students. And then if you go to the grade book, it looks like a grade book, and you can weight things the way you want to weight things. If you need to weight things, like some districts, you have to weight certain things. So you can make that functionality happen here. You can categorize different things together. So it has been great for classroom experience, and students get access to their portfolio whenever they want, and they can continually add to it whenever they want. And so on our growth days, that's what they're doing. So they're looking at their portfolio and they're seeing their current growth on those learning goals. And then they're instructed to choose, like what we did with our spreadsheet, was we want you to spend one period a week working on what you need to work on. So go and choose a learning goal that might show currently 3 stars or a color, and work on the tasks that are in there. So if you look at, say, this task, and I'm pulling up what an activity looks like in Freshgrade, what we do in there is we can preload it with some tasks and give them some instructions. Like, if you're at this current understanding or current level, you can move towards this one by completing some of these tasks and taking pictures of your work and uploading them. So it's kind of like an ongoing thing that students can self-choose where they need the most work. We talked last night too that you can load it with help videos if you want on a learning goal. And so it's all customized to the learning goal, but also to the student on those specific days, because everybody in that classroom on that day can be working on something different. So it's been a nice tool to kind of do all that. It takes some setting up, but it's been a great tool to help do the things that you're asking about.
So in theory, you can take a picture of the student's assessment and upload it to their portfolio. So you have a record of their assessment piece.
Yep.
Oh, that's amazing.
And sometimes when I'm marking those quizzes that come in, and it's like, yes, this is another consistently done well problem, you could take a picture of it, put it in, and you've got that recorded to help you think about when you go to make the mark, right? So it's like, I don't like to say like the kids got this mark on this day, because it's like, we want to think when I have to give a mark, because I want my students to think, where am I on the learning goals? I don't want to be like, what do I have in the course? Like,
it's an assessment as learning, right?
Right. So it's like, I want you to think about where, if you're on the Pythagorean theorem and you want to work towards improving your understanding and skill level on solving problems with the Pythagorean theorem, then I want you to think about that, not think about other things. So let's work towards doing that right now on today, when somebody else is doing something else. Kyle, you want to jump in?
Yeah, well, I was just going to say, like, that was awesome. I'm so happy we had the visual there so everyone can see it and kind of get that sort of glimpse. That's the key for us, is that the entire purpose of assessment is to get kids to want to continually get better. Instead of, like, in my experience, I remember being in school, it was like a get done mentality. Like, did I get it done? And that's where really trying to set it up for students not to ever think that it's like, oh, I'm now done. It's like, no, now you're ready for your next challenge. But let's focus on the things that make the most sense to focus on. So let's focus on those sort of weak link ideas. So let's really dive into those. Let's continuously get that grade reflective of what you know now, not what you knew last week or what you knew 3 months ago. And let's just continue pushing to get better and better, because that's really what we're after, right? We want kids to be lifelong learners. We want them to realize that, hey, things aren't going to always come easily. Like, some students are lucky to have that sort of, it seems to come easily to them. But typically when we see those types of students, they're like John and I. If my teachers would have pressed me more in school in the way that John's showing with like Freshgrade, or whether you're using a spreadsheet or even just a paper sort of tracking running record, that would have pushed me to realize that I actually didn't know as much as I thought. I was just really good at answer getting.
Right.
And we don't want kids to kind of just rest on that they got the answers right, even for challenging problems. When they do get a challenging problem, I want to ask you questions about that. I want to ask you some focusing questions that will really give me an understanding as to whether they understand how they got to the answer they got to. Can they show it in different ways? Like, can they model it? So these are different things that kind of pull in parts of that achievement chart that you had referenced earlier, but then also just kind of like the mathematical processes that tend to come up a lot when we're chatting. In the US, the math practices is what they would typically call those. So with this is like a lot going on here. Hopefully you don't find this conversation overwhelming. Hopefully
not at all.
Like, a little bit of maybe helping you kind of aim your focus a little bit. You've got to start somewhere. So I'm wondering, before we wrap up, are there any big takeaways here in terms of like, what's your focus over the next couple weeks going to be as you get ready for this new school year come September?
So yeah, guys, thank you. So definitely really trying to always keep in my mind, what is the purpose of assessment? And that should be driving the assessment pieces that I give my students. And looking at the mastery, kind of like you said, it's just not necessarily kind of like a one-off, here are 3 questions, you pick and go. It's trying to really build in, starting at maybe that beginner/intermediate level, and then slowly working towards it, building those skills with my students, and then attempting to start looking at those expert or those mastery type of questions. And then translating that, John, I love that Freshgrade. It looks amazing. Really being able to capture that and building the students, bringing them into that piece so they can upload their work. And like you said, the slide that you showed where they're picking their learning goals, I really like that piece as well. And they can say, okay, you know what? Yeah, this learning goal here, I'm struggling a bit. That's what I want to work on. I'm going to ask, Mr. Sevel, how I can work on that learning goal. And we're myself providing them with different ways to achieve that particular learning goal. So that really stood out to me as well. And again, just really understanding, I like how you had said, John, I think it was you had said, we want to always kind of put a mark on it to show somebody this is what they've got, right? We do as teachers face that pressure of our admin and parents. And, we've got this provincial report card, at least at the elementary level, where we've got to report on each strand twice and everything is so broken down into specific strand. I wish they would change that and make it a general mark overall at the end of the year, like the expectation says by the end of grade 7, or not in January or February. But lots of learning, guys. So that's amazing. Definitely, thank you. That's been a huge help. So certainly for my takeaway, I'm going to look a lot more at that Freshgrade, continue on through the academy and completing the courses and learning a lot more from you guys and everyone else in the academy, and pushing my learning as well.
Awesome stuff. Like we said earlier, we will be putting more information about these days and the ideas about assessment as a mini course coming up. We'll be working on that. That'll keep us busy for a little bit.
As you guys start your teaching in September, right?
Yeah. Right. And actually too, John, I don't know if it's a bit early to talk about it, but we actually were chatting with the folks from Freshgrade, and they had some really cool things that they wanted to share with folks in the academy. And then also we're trying to work on something for those who are listening to the podcast. So in the bumper after the episode, which we typically record later, hopefully we'll have something to share with you from Freshgrade so that folks who are listening to the podcast, they can dive in, they can try it out. It is a free tool, so keeping that in mind, but they also have some other premium options. Right. So we're really trying to find ways that we can offer the biggest bang for everybody's buck. So we'll try to find a way to offer something that kind of gets folks a little bit of the up and up on the freemium version of Freshgrade. So
Awesome. Thanks so much, Steven, for joining us.
Thank you for your time, gentlemen. I really appreciate everything that you're doing on your websites, and the Tap Into Teen Minds is awesome. All those questions, I've done so many of them with my students. They love it. So guys, thank you so much for the work that you're doing to support us, and really much appreciated. And, taking your time on our summer vacation to chat has been really, really helpful. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Steven. Thank you. It just makes it worthwhile for us to talk to great teachers like yourself. One last thing. Would you mind coming back on and having a conversation in a few months after we start the school year and get your feet wet with some of the changes that you're going to try to implement? We'd love to have a conversation, follow up.
I'd love to.
Talk about how that's going for you.
Yeah. And I hope my questions weren't all over the place, and I hope, people were able to follow along, and if they've had, thinking the same way, it's going to help them out as well. So,
you know what, your questions, we've heard them so many times that's why we had said, hey, let's hop on a call here. And you know what, I mean, this is teaching, good reflective teaching ends up where you have all these questions. It seems like never ending questions. So I'm so happy that you brought them to the forefront here. You put yourself in a vulnerable position, which I think is key in order to do any sort of collaborative work and any sort of learning beyond what we're capable of doing independently, which That's why John and I do this together. You know, we learn so much from each other just by throwing out an idea. It's like, I think I'm stumped on something, and then John comes at it from a completely different perspective. And then I go, oh yeah, like, why didn't I think of that? You know, so that's what this is all about. And I'm so happy that folks like you are taking advantage of that. And, you know, let us know how we can help along the way. And we can't wait to do that check-in call with you and,
100%.
And see how things are progressing along.
Looking forward to it, gentlemen. Thank you so much.
Awesome.
Okay, have a great rest of the day and a great rest of the summer and a great start in September.
Awesome.
You too.
Take care.
Take care. We'll see you later. Have a good one.
Ciao.
As always, both John and I learned so much from these Math Mentoring Moment episodes. But as always, in order to ensure we hang on to that new learning instead of letting it erase like footprints in the sand, we must reflect on what we've learned. An excellent way to do this and make sure the learning sticks is to reflect and create a plan for yourself to take action on something that you've learned from this episode.
A great way to hold yourself accountable is to write it down, or even better, share it with someone, your partner, colleagues, or another member of the Make Math Moment community, or comment on the show notes page, or tag us on social media at Make Math Moments, or you can reach out to us in our free private Facebook group, Math Moment Makers, K through 12.
Awesome stuff. And again, make sure you check out that spiraling guide by going to makemathmoments.com/spiral. You've got a lot of reading content there, and also an optional 3-day video series that you can check out so that you can take a deep dive into spiraling.
Are you interested in joining us for an upcoming Math Mentoring Moment episode where you can share a big math class struggle? Apply over at makemathmoments.com/mentor. That's makemathmoments.com/mentor.
And in order to ensure you don't miss out on any new episodes as they come out each week, be sure to hit that subscribe button on your favorite podcast platform. Ratings and reviews are appreciated and will help the message get out to more people.
Show notes and links to resources from this episode can be found at makemathmoments.com/episode 52. Again, that is makemathmoments.com/episode 52.
Well, I think you all know what that means. Until next time, I'm Kyle Pierce.
And I'm John Orr.
High fives for us.
And high fives for you.